Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and make sure you guys are liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast with everybody, especially those people who really like true crime and like creepy stories and that kind of thing. Today, I'm excited to talk about our individual, but first, I do want to say sorry about the late start on the podcast this week, guys. This summer's kicking my butt. I don't know about you guys, but it's been super fun, but there's a lot going on. Speaking of a lot going on, this episode, I was a little inspired because I will soon be visiting where this individual is from and where he walked and talked and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm excited because I will be in these places. And this person ruled over an empire that shared actually quite a few horrible humans in history, which I'm sure we will talk about more of them later on this podcast. But today we're specifically going to talk about someone whose name means little boots. Isn't that so cute? It's such an intimidating nickname, right? Or bootykins. They also called him bootykins. What an intimidating name, right? And he would actually be furious if he knew that that is what he was known as. And that's what people think his name is. He would be furious because he hated that name. And this person supposedly made his horse into a consort, basically a leader in his court. He was thought to have gone insane, and a lot of his actions actually seem to reflect that. He was super brutal, a ruthless leader, and it's said that he ruled his people with an iron fist and made people worship him like a living god. So he's even quoted as to saying, "Let them hate me, so long as they fear me." Who are we talking about today? Well, obviously, Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or what he is better known as, Caligula. That is who we are talking about today. Let's get into this, guys. I'm excited to talk about this Roman emperor. Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, aka Caligula, was, well, his actual name. So Caligula is his nickname, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus actually means thrasher of the Germans. Now, that's a little more intimidating than Caligula or Little Boots, but he was born on August 31st in the year 12. Yep, that's how far back we're going this time, guys. We're back to the year number 12 AD. So he was actually born to a very popular Roman general named Germanicus, also known as the Blue-Eyed Prince of Rome. His mother was Agrippa, and she was the granddaughter of Augustus Julius Caesar, the first ever emperor of Rome. So in today's terms, you could say that Caligula's parents would have been as popular as, dare I say, Taylor Swift, Chris Pratt, and the Kardashians, like all combined together. That's how popular they were with the people. And not only that, they were also incredibly powerful. Like, take a bunch of world leaders and just smash them together, like the world leaders, best world leaders, smash them together. And that's about how much power these people had. They were well known. They had a very strong bloodline. So people were in love with this family. And the people especially loved Caligula's father. He was such a well-known general because he was so successful in his battles, and he came from such a strong bloodline. He was known to be super kind and giving and had a ton of fans among the Roman people. And in 14 AD, he was actually in Germany fighting a war, and Caligula joined him there. Both Caligula and his mother went to the war camp, the military camp, with Caligula's father. So that is basically where Caligula grew up, was in the military camps, surrounded by war and fighting. And basically, his toys were the weapons of war and his play buddies were the soldiers and that kind of thing. That's the kind of environment that Caligula grew up in. And because he was raised in the actual barracks in the camps of the military, his mother, which is something I would totally do, dressed him up in a little itty bitty soldier's uniform, including the boots, and he was super adorable, and all the troops absolutely loved him and called him Caligula, which means little boots or bootykins, because the soldiers just thought he was so cute. And the shoes that soldiers wore were actually called Caligae, hence the Caligula, because of the Caligae that they wore on their feet. It was boots with like these metal nails in them, and he wore little mini ones. So that's how he got his nickname as Caligula. As he grew older, he hated that name and did not want anyone calling him that name, because it was like calling him Bootykins. Like if you called Caligula the Emperor Bootykins, like how funny would that be? I'm sure he would have just put you to death. Anyways, so because the soldiers really thought he was adorable, and they became very loyal to the family. And just imagine what being raised in basically a war zone in a military camp would do to you mentally. I think it would desensitize you a little bit to violence. Just a titch. I don't know. I could be wrong on that one. But another thing that's important to note about Caligula's father was he was actually the biological nephew and adopted son of the current emperor of Rome, who was Tiberius. And I'll kind of explain Tiberius in a second. He is also the worst. So Tiberius was the Roman emperor before Caligula. And I'll tell you right now, this guy's not a good dude. And he is for sure going to be a figure in one of my episodes in the future, because he was a pretty big tyrant. But Tiberius loved Caligula's father, and that is why his dad actually had a lot of power. But soon Tiberius became very intimidated by Caligula's father and kind of jealous at his popularity, and saw him as a threat to the throne. Because I'll explain how you took over the throne of Rome in a second, but it was violent. We'll just say that. It was violent. So, because Tiberius was threatened, at the age of 7, in the year 19 AD, Caligula's dad actually died on a mission to Syria. They had reached Antioch, Greece, and his dad was only 33 years old, which is crazy. That seems so young to me. I'm not that old, just so you know, but 33 seems pretty young. But he had had a really long illness, and Germanicus, so Caligula's dad, believed that Piso, a governor that they had just recently visited, had actually poisoned him by the orders of Tiberius. So Caligula's dad believed that he had been murdered by Tiberius and let people know before he passed away, like, I think he poisoned me. And when you learn about how people deal with these threats to their power, I think you'll probably agree with him that he was definitely for sure murdered. So the people of Rome were actually devastated at the loss of Germanicus, Caligula's dad. random people in the street would just break down crying, like just be walking down the street and just suddenly just start weeping and wailing in the streets, right? So the only people in the entirety of Rome who didn't seem to be upset by the death of the most popular general in Rome was Tiberius and his mother, who wouldn't even authorize a state funeral for Germanicus when his ashes arrived back in Rome. So talk about a guilty conscience, like how to make it obvious that you murdered someone. That would be it. So the man accused of poisoning Caligula's father conveniently killed himself 3 days before his trial. So I wonder if he had anything to do with that. Weird. Or here's a theory of my own. Did he actually kill himself, or was he ordered to kill himself so the emperor wouldn't get caught in the thick of it? Just something to think about. Was he ordered to do it, or did he do it himself? I think it's a good question to consider. Anyways, the death of his father actually forced Caligula's mother, Agrippina, to return to Rome with all 6 of her children. Now, when she got back to Rome, she obviously had a beef with the Emperor Tiberius because she believed her husband. She believed that Tiberius had caused her husband's death. And soon the bitter feud actually burned really hot in between the two of those guys. Sorry, in between the emperor and Caligula's mother, that it would eventually lead to the entire destruction of Caligula's family. Because Tiberius was convinced that Caligula's mother was plotting against him to try and take the seat of power, so he actually banished her to a distant island off of the coast of Italy. And at around the age of 19, Caligula was actually summoned away from his mother to join Tiberius on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples. So I'll describe this island really quick because it is important. It is a very important side note. This island has super steep cliffs that connect to the ocean. So there's no beaches here. It's really crazy steep cliffs. And that is where Tiberius actually built his palace. And this is where he kept most of his power in ruling Rome. It's from this palace on top of these cliffs. So he pulled Tiberius to his side, and historians aren't actually really sure why Tiberius did this, why he summoned Caligula to join him. Some people think it was to keep a really close eye on Caligula to make sure he wasn't plotting to get a hold of the power. Some people think it was Tiberius really liked Caligula and wanted him around and to tutor him and help him. And they think that he was there to be trained to take over as emperor whenever Tiberius passed away. So there's no sure theory about what his real motives were to have him there, but this began the teachings of Caligula on how to become an effective ruler, and what that actually meant was how to become a tyrant and the joys of excess. And I will explain later what the joys of excess means. But after exposing Caligula to all of this, like all the violence, all the tyranny, and all of the excess, which I'm sure you can guess what that is, after he exposed Caligula to this, Tiberius was actually known to have said, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." So he was aware that Caligula kind of had a violent side to him. He was aware that he was harboring some violence and things within. So to talk about the excess, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by excess. Like I mentioned, Tiberius's palace was on top of these really high cliffs that led to the ocean. Now, this is important in the lessons that he was teaching Caligula because anyone Tiberius didn't like, didn't have any use for, or just got sick of playing with, which, included women that he slept with, or even children that he slept with, he would throw over the sides of these cliffs because he was done with them. He didn't need them any longer, so he just tossed them over the side of the cliff. And he had a platoon of soldiers stationed in a boat at the bottom of these cliffs to finish the job if anyone survived. And what did they use? Their oars. That is how they ended up, finishing the job. So Caligula is exposed to this. Tiberius also had young boys who were specifically there to swim between his legs in the pool and nibble on, I'll let you use your imagination on that one. I don't want to go into detail on that one. And this is a life that Caligula was a part of. These are the excesses that Caligula thought were a normal part of life and a normal part of ruling. And while all of this was happening, while Caligula was living in the life of luxury and just enjoying all this excess, his mother was being beaten up. Like, she actually lost sight in one of her eyes and eventually went on a hunger strike, was force-fed, and eventually died of starvation. In addition to that, both of his brothers were also killed in violent ways. They were murdered. And so soon it was just Caligula and his 3 sisters left in the family. Now, his sisters were left alone because women had no power in this era. And you'll see why. Well, not why, but you'll see more examples of that later in the episode. But that's why his sisters were left alone. But soon it was just Caligula and his 3 sisters. So Caligula was aware at this point in his life that he was actually in a very precarious position. He had to learn that he could show no emotions in front of Tiberius. Like, when he found out his mother had died and his brothers had been killed, he had to act like it didn't bother him at all, because if he had cried or showed any kind of emotion, that could be the end of him. Tiberius could have him killed. So he learned to bury his emotions deep, deep down inside of him. And this is where we get into how did they choose their leaders in Rome? If you think that our election system in the United States is ridiculous, wait till you hear how they decided who had the power in Rome. The only way was succession, aka taking over the power in Rome by bumping off another family member. So just making sure you're killing that family member so you can have their power. That's how it worked. No voting, no fighting for power. No, you just murdered them. Flat out murdered them. So there wasn't even a clear line of succession. It wasn't even okay, so this person was the original leader, so then it's his son, and then his son, and then no. Because there were multiple lines of succession, because they had multiple different children with multiple different people. So the line of succession was very fuzzy. So not only were they competing with other family members, but they were competing with mothers who were vying for their children to become a leader. They were competing with slaves who wanted to dictate who their new master would be. They had to dictate or fight with security guards who preferred certain people over other people. So there was a lot of drama behind the politics in Rome. When you weren't aware of that already, Julius Caesar getting murdered. Anyways, that's just how they did succession, is killing people off. Literally, in the first 100 years of Rome, there isn't one emperor that wasn't murdered so someone else could take his place. That is just bonkers. Like, that is a bonkers way to run your country. But I guess if it worked, Rome, I mean, it didn't because you're not around anymore, but I guess it worked at the time. So, with this in mind, it shouldn't come as a surprise that it is rumored that Caligula actually murdered Tiberius. Some say he smothered Tiberius in his sleep with a pillow. Others say that he actually had the captain of the Praetorian Guard do the deed for Caligula because, of course, he had plenty of other people to do his dirty work. He had plenty of servants and guards that were willing to do that kind of thing. No matter how it happened, Tiberius was dead on March 16th, 37 AD. And 2 days later, on March 18th, 37 AD, Caligula was declared the emperor and ruler over the Roman Empire. He was Rome's third emperor, and he was only 24 years old. 24, taking the power of the strongest, most mighty country in the world at the time. That is so nuts. So the people of Rome were actually ecstatic because he was the son of their favorite Roman military leader. He basically was the military's mascot, so the military absolutely loved him and was excited to have him as their leader. And he was the great-grandson of Caesar Augustus, the founder of Rome. The people really believed that they were finally going to get the kind of leader that they always wanted. And they guessed incorrectly. They were not good at guessing that this kid was going to be a good leader. So, to cement the idea of his power and right to the throne, he actually made a really big show of bringing his mother's ashes back to Rome. Like, he threw a ginormous parade and celebrations and brought her ashes back to the mausoleum of Augustus, basically showing everyone, I am the ruler. I have a right to be here because this is my blood. I am royalty. You will bow to me, basically, is what he said when he brought his mother's ashes back to Rome. So Caligula was actually known to be a pretty generous ruler. Well, at first anyways, it's said that he would go to the roof of buildings and toss money into the crowds on the street. And they really loved this. They really thought he was such an incredible man because he was throwing all kinds of wealth at the people. And a fun fact about the coins that he would throw to the people, this was actually a really good way for him to get propaganda out to the people to say, look at me, I'm an amazing emperor. Not only in the sense that, hey, look, we got tons of free money from our emperor, look how amazing he is. But also on the coins themselves were images of Caligula and things that emphasized who his parents were, who his great-grandparents were, and solidified the proof that he should be the rightful ruler of Rome. So it's propaganda and money all at the same time. He also had so much wealth and precious stones that he had them embedded in the walls of his palace. He added them to boats and so many other things. He even wore slippers that were covered in pearls because he liked them a lot. And he thought they looked super nice and would show them off to his people. And I know what you're thinking at this moment. You're thinking, okay, so you're telling me this is a horrible human in history, right? He's handing out money to his people. He's known to be super generous. He wears pearls on his feet because they look pretty and nice. And I will also say he built the aqueducts. He started the construction of the aqueducts, and he started building his own palace in 64 AD. His palace was actually destroyed, so it doesn't exist anymore, but he rebuilt the whole thing and remodeled it, which was like the first time that had ever been done. Like, he he even interacted with his subjects. Like, he had a group of Jews who came to petition him because they were being persecuted and they really needed the persecution to stop. So they came to see Caligula and petition him to stop the persecution in the area that they were located. Caligula at the time was in the middle of remodeling his palace and made them walk around while he was telling everyone how he wanted it fixed and remodeled, barely paying any attention to them, and finally said, "Wait a second, you're the God haters who don't believe that I am a god? And anyways, why don't you eat pork?" And so one of the Jews that was there in the party said, "Well, a lot of people don't eat a lot of things. Like, some people don't eat lamb." And Caligula immediately responded, "Well, I'm not surprised. It tastes horrible." And so they all started laughing and joking around. So he was able to have a sense of humor and interacted pretty well with his subjects. And so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this is supposed to be an episode about a horrible human. This guy is not a horrible human. What's the deal? He isn't that bad. Well, be patient, my friend. Be patient, my friends. I'm getting there. We will get there, and I promise he is worthy of the title of horrible human in history. So he, like I said, had his fancy slippers. He didn't seem to be super intimidating because he seemed super generous. Now, this is what made Caligula dangerous, is he did come across in this non-intimidating, non-threatening, lighthearted way, but you never knew what was reality and what was fake. And by that, I have a couple examples. Like, he invited everyone over for a feast, and when they came, it looked like this big, amazing spread of food. But once you actually got close to it, all the food was made out of gold. So you had nothing to eat. But what do? Like, do you pretend to eat the food and humor the emperor? Or do you just tell him how amazing it is, how much wealth he has? Like, what do you do? How do you react in that situation? And Caligula liked to mess with people's minds to show his control and power over them. This is an example of not knowing, like, how do I react? What do I do? And in addition to that, like, what you thought was fake could actually be really deadly. Like, Caligula had a practice gladiator fight with another man who was using wooden swords. Well, it turned out Caligula had a real weapon. He had an actual sword. So while the other man was fighting with a wooden sword, he ended up dying because Caligula had a real sword in this practice. So he was really dangerous in the sense that you never knew, like, what was really happening, what wasn't. Like, where do I stand with this guy? So he was sneaky, conniving, and very manipulative, and loved playing with people's minds. And I'll give you more examples of that in a second. But Caligula was constantly under threat. Like, there's always someone vying to take his power. Like, everyone wanted to be the emperor of Rome. It's the most powerful country in the world. Who wouldn't want that power? So he actually had specific guards, and they had to have a specific password that he made up every single day so he would know who was safe to be around. This is a spoiler that is important to know for later, and I will tell you later why, but just know his guards were the people he trusted the most. Now, he also had spies throughout his servants because they weren't really threatening. They couldn't get any power, supposedly. Dun, dun, dun. Like I said, spoilers. But he became very paranoid, and he knew that there was a lot of people wanting his power. So it really started to mess with his mind. And historians think that this is where he started to become more of a ruthless monster, is when he started to get more paranoid. And they even think this is when he went a little bit crazy. I actually don't think that's what caused him to go crazy personally. because he actually came down with a pretty severe illness to the point where most people believed he was going to die. There were people, just the common citizens, upset, like crying that he was on the verge of death, thinking that he was going to die. And there was a lot of people that actually started plotting on who was going to take his position of power once he died. And I think his illness was so severe, and he probably got a severe enough temperature, like a really high temperature, that it actually affected his brain a little bit and added to the paranoia, because all these people started plotting against him while he was recovering from his illness. So it made him even more paranoid. So I think a mix between possible brain damage from a severe illness that could have raised his temperature high enough that it could have caused brain damage, mixed with the paranoia of everyone trying to take his power while he was sick. I think that's why he went crazy. But one record keeper from the time actually described Caligula as a hollow-eyed insomniac who regularly conversed with the moon. He conversed with the moon. Maybe he was just talking to himself and this individual just thought he was cuckoo crazy, but we don't know. He also started wearing really eccentric costumes. Like, he dressed up like the gods Apollo and Venus, and even as Alexander the Great. He started wearing costumes everywhere he went. And one of the first major things that happened that kind of made people think he was losing it a little bit was he gave his horse, Incantus, which also means speedy, by the way, his own palace, fed him oats with gold in it, and even made him a consul of Rome, basically a person with a lot of power. Although some people think that he was joking when he did this, like basically talking to his friends saying, you know what, I wouldn't trust any of you to be a consul. I would rather have my horse be a consul. So they think it kind of could have been a sarcastic remark, but that's been kind of an ongoing thing throughout history, is he made his own horse a person of power in Rome. So he, in 40 AD, and this was another sign that he might be cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. In 40 AD, he made his troops attack the ocean. Yes, that is right. He made his troops attack the ocean. It said he wanted to attack Britain, but wasn't able to because he couldn't find a way to cross the ocean. And he became furious with the god Neptune for not allowing him to take over Britain. Britain was like this mysterious country across the ocean that he wanted to conquer, but was not able to because of the ocean. So he was so mad at the god Neptune from preventing his conquering of Britain that he ordered his troops attack the ocean and take seashells home as their trophies of victory. So, yeah, I think he was a little crazy, because literally, I'm just picturing a bunch of men like stabbing the water with spears and like shooting arrows into it. Oh, it's kind of a ridiculous image. But the most scandalous thing about Caligula would actually be his sex life. He basically turned his palace into a brothel. Like, he liked to dress up in women's clothing, and he enjoyed getting it on so much that he wore out all of his dance partners, including the men. He basically would do it anywhere, with anyone, at any time, in all the wrong places, with all the wrong people, married women, little boys, virgins, you name it. He was down to clown. He was insatiable. And all of that is pretty bad. But don't worry if you think it couldn't get any more scandalous. Oh, it can. His favorite tango partner was his 3 sisters, especially his younger sister, Drusilla, which we will talk a little bit more about later. But my favorite quote in one of the documentaries I watched in my research, it made me laugh pretty hard. The host is this older woman. She's phenomenal. Anyway, she said, "If we were to shoot a porn Roman style, we would be bound to cast Caligula as the lead." That's how scandalous this guy was. Like, it was that bad. Oh, it just made me laugh when she said that, because it's true. Like, he was that bad. And part of this is the messing with the minds of people. So he liked to mess with the aristocracy so much that what he would do is actually throw a dinner party, and then in the middle of this dinner party, he would vanish with one of the wives of the other men at the party, and then would come back with obvious signs that they had been doing things. And Caligula would turn to the husband and say, "Well, she isn't that good in bed, is she?" Like, humiliating both the man and the woman in the partnership. Or he would just tease and be like, "Wow, I mean, you got a good one over here. She did really well." Like, those kinds of things to really embarrass people and demoralize them. He also would sit in a chair and watch as the people came into the party, basically checking them out like a slave market to decide which people he would have his way with for the evening. It showed the elite what power he had, and he could do whatever he wanted with whomever he wanted at any point in time, is basically the message he was sending to all the other people in the aristocracy. Now, he even built a boat. And when I say a boat, I mean a large boat, or basically a floating villa, called the Boats of Nemi. These were basically pleasure barges that he would go to and just have a good old time and do whatever he wanted to do. I'm sure you can guess what those things were based off of the things we just talked about. Fun side note on these barges is Mussolini was actually the one who found the remains of the boats in the bottom of a lake and sent them to a museum, where they happened to be destroyed during World War II. So we don't have very much of those boats left, but they were massive. You can look up pictures. They were ginormous. And it was just a pleasure boat to do whatever. They were so extravagant, too. And he actually spent so much of the wealth. He basically drained the treasury of Rome to make such a lavish lifestyle for himself. So I want to touch back on Drusilla now. So Drusilla is his youngest sister that he had relations with, and apparently the first time they were discovered was actually by their grandmother when he was a younger boy, and she found them in bed together. He was madly, madly in love with her, and they had a very, very close relationship, and she had a lot of influence. So did his other sisters, but she was basically worshipped by him and made to be worshipped basically by anyone in Rome because he loved her so much. Now, when she died in her 20s, he was devastated. He would run to the country and then come back to Rome. He would gamble, drink, and forced the whole of Rome to be in the state of mourning for 2 weeks straight. Caligula eventually married a woman that a lot of people said was not very attractive, and she was quote unquote old. I bet by old they meant like late 20s, probably early 30s. I mean, so old, right? But she was said not to be super attractive, but he really loved her. And they had a daughter together, and they actually named their daughter after his dead sister. That's how much he loved her. And side note on his wife, he used to parade her around naked in front of the military men to show her off. And unbeknownst to him, most of the men didn't appreciate it because they didn't really find her super attractive. But he did it anyways because he was head over heels for her and was just like, she is the most beautiful woman in the world, which is kind of sweet. But also parading her off naked in front of a bunch of men, not super sweet. Just saying. He also liked to flirt with his wife by threatening to kill her. Things like, I could have your throat cut at any moment, and then kissing her neck. And apparently she didn't mind her life being threatened. It was a pretty big turn on for her. So anyways, there's the story of his wife. But basically, to sum up, he named his daughter after his dead sister. That's how in love he was with her. Now, after Caligula's illness, not only did his sexual appetite get larger, but his thirst for violence did too. He often would force families to watch as he had their children killed. And while the children were dying and being tortured, the parents were forced to smile and even cheer at the death of their children before he would actually turn and kill the parents as well. He also, in addition to his lavish dinner parties, would throw other parties where he would have someone killed and often invited the individual's loved ones so they would be there to watch it. And they had to act like they were having a good time at this party or else he would kill them too. He also liked to ensure that his victims lived as long as humanly possible while they were being killed. So he would usually start by inflicting small cuts or like bruises or those kinds of things, and then slowly escalate it to more brutal forms of torture before he would ultimately kill them. Now, remember, this was the time of the Colosseum, the gladiators fighting to the death. Like, that was your entertainment. So it says something when the people of Rome were horrified at the brutality of their emperor. These people watched people be murdered for entertainment, and they thought what their emperor was doing was horrific. Just food for thought there. Now, Caligula truly believed that he was a living god and made people bow down to worship him and kiss his feet. He would even sit in the palace of gods where, by the way, he built a large bridge to reach so he could walk above the people and go visit the gods whenever he wanted. And he would wait in that temple, posed as a god, waiting for people to come and worship him. He even had flamingos sacrificed to him. Flamingos, those poor birds, sacrificed to a human god. Oh man, this guy just sounds nuts. Anyways, like I said, he lived such an extravagant lifestyle and demanded so much of his people that he drained the treasury with his extravagance and spending. And all of this excess and violence was the opposite of what the people were wanting in a leader. They had hoped that he would be wise and kind like his father, but it turned out to be much, much worse than his successor, Tiberius. He was horrible and awful. And even with all the violence and excess, a lot of the people still really liked him. I mean, it's probably because he threw money off of roofs, but he was their hero's son, and their great general had instilled so much faith in the people that they just thought this kid has to be good because of him. But he wasn't. And he actually had a lot of enemies who would soon come back to take their revenge. On the 22nd of January, 41 AD, after only 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Yeah, he did all of that in 3 years and 10 months, guys. He was not emperor for super long. He was murdered on his way home. He had been at the theater watching some athletic sports and decided he wanted to go home and take a bath before he went to his other activities for the evening. So he was going home down this tunnel and he saw his personal guards coming the other direction. And he thought, you know what? That's fine. Didn't really think much about it because he believed that he was safe. Those were the men that were hired to keep him safe. Well, wouldn't you know, his own servants were the ones who killed him. They jumped him as he started to pass them. And the first stab was towards his throat or chin. They're not sure it's in that area, but he actually survived that. But he didn't survive the 29 other times that he was stabbed. So he died pretty quickly. And there are rumors that say that his attackers even ate pieces of his flesh after they killed him. So pretty gross. But Caligula was dead at 28 years old. And to ensure that no one else could inherit the throne, they killed his wife, his supposedly ugly wife. I don't know if she really was. But they killed his wife and his child too. You know, as you do in Rome, to ensure your power is never taken again. Which doesn't work out well for anyone, but there was no mourning allowed for Caligula or his wife. With him dead and out of the way, the ruling class almost immediately began to try and wipe his name and his image and its existence out of the history. They removed all the statues or defaced them and replaced the money or scratched his face off of the coins because the new leader, his uncle Claudius, had taken the throne after Caligula's death. So they were trying real quick to replace him and replace any memory of him. That's why it's interesting that we call him Caligula, because that was probably part of the propaganda that they pushed after Caligula was dead. Instead of calling him by his proper name, they all called him Caligula. So it's interesting that that has stuck throughout history. And it was a tool, basically propaganda, to wipe his name off of the planet. Now, Caligula is forever going to be remembered as an emperor who expressed moral excess and violence and brutality and mostly insanity. He was just one of many of the brutal leaders of the Roman Empire, but because of his lust and his violence, he's our horrible human in history for the week. He did so many terrible, terrible things and treated people terribly, which he probably learned from his uncle, not his parents. But he was just, in 3 years and 10 months, did so much damage. It's insane. So what do you guys think of Caligula? Do you think there was an even worse Roman emperor? Like, I want to hear your thoughts. Would you have actually wanted to live in this ancient Rome under his rule? I don't think I would, because, you know, I'm pretty attractive. He wouldn't have been able to resist, right? I'm just kidding. But I think it would be a kind of scary time because you wouldn't know if he was sane. You wouldn't know what he was going to do next or if you were under threat. I think it would have been a really scary time. So tell me what you think. Do you think there's a worse Roman emperor out there? I want to know, like, what do you guys think of Caligula? Share in the comments below because I really want to hear your guys' insight. So if you liked today's episode or any of the episodes, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast with everybody so they can join in on the fun. Next week, as we you have to join me as we dive into this story about aliens. Yes, that's right. Aliens and mass suicide. We are going to be talking about another cult. And if you thought the other two we've talked about so far were pretty crazy sounding, just wait. We are going to be talking about the Heaven's Gate cult and their crazy leaders, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. This story is a wild ride, guys, so make sure you buckle up for next week's episode of Horrible Humans in History. we will see you guys next week.